Good afternoon, everybody. I am Kyla Lee Ward, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Redback Room. Now, this initiative of the Australian Horror Writers Association, it is going to be a bi-monthly webcast featuring Australian horror authors, both new and established. You will get to hear them read a sample of your work. You will get to see me ask them questions about this work and what they have done in the past and what they have prepared for the future. You will then be permitted to ask questions yourselves. Australia's unique landscape and history has created many, many unique works of horror. And our guests this afternoon are continuing that fine tradition. Kaaron Warren, Alan Baxter, welcome to the Redback Room.
Thank you, Kyla. It's great to be here.
Now, I'm so glad you could join us. I'm glad all you watching could join us, whether it is now, as we're recording, or in the future. Now, as this is the first time we've done all this, I feel obliged to ask you both, is this your first substantial experience with redbacks? Really, they're the quintessential Australian native, both utterly deadly and honestly quite beautiful.
They are quite beautiful. I actually have which I was thinking about it as you were talking there, I actually have a little stone redback that myself and a few other women writers, I think you maybe got one too, Kyla. We were part of a redback series. Do you remember that?
I remember.
Early on with the AHWA, and there was a special redback women it was, and we all got a little redback to say thank you for our stories.
Yes, it was the redback issue of Brimstone.
Yes,
magazine.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's a long time ago.
Thank you, Angela, if you're watching.
Angela Tellis, wonderful editor and instigator and all sorts.
Now, Alan, what about you?
We don't have many redbacks where I am down in Dairy Country. I've seen literally one in the time that I've been here. But my in-laws live up in the Blue Mountains where there are many redbacks. My son once, when he was little, he wanted to ride on his cousin's little plastic motorbike thing. And my brother-in-law said, just a minute, we'll just double check because we sometimes get spiders. And he turned it over and there were 7 redbacks living in it, tucked in various corners. And so, yeah, so those are my close encounters with redbacks, but at the in-laws, thankfully, not at my house. We get the big huntsman in our house instead, which are entirely less deadly and sort of cuter.
Good company, huntsmans.
Yeah.
Very good company. Now, we have 2 wonderful guests, but I can only handle them one at a time. And so, Kaaron, if you don't mind, Kaaron Warren, everybody. Prolific, talented Canberra resident, whom is commonly suspected of having bodies buried in her back garden.
It's not true. They're next door. I swear the neighbours, I swear they dig at all hours back there, and they've built this sort of reinforced shed that has no windows. I'm just saying.
Well, with friends like these. So, you've been publishing for a long time, and you started very young. So I feel free to say you've been publishing over at least 30 years.
1993 was my first published story. Crazy long time ago.
Oh, crazy. But yes, in that time, you have clocked up, 5 novels?
Yeah.
6 single author collections.
I think it's 7 actually. I think it's 7. There was a electronic only one that everyone forgets about. So 7.
Oh, I thought I got them all. Damn. And certainly over 100 short stories. In fact, by now it's probably closer to 2.
Mm.
Oh, what can we say? One of my first encounters with you was as the author of The Hanging People.
Yes.
In the 90s Australian horror magazine, Blood Songs.
Yeah.
I remember meeting you at the Australian Writers Centre, and that's how you were introduced to me.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that really clearly, Kyla. And how I was, you know, I mean, I still get really thrilled when someone's read something that I've written and enjoyed it, but I still remember you being so engaged with it. And because it's quite a strange story, of course. I write a lot of strange stories, but I just remember your...
Well, you wouldn't be here otherwise.
Well, maybe. In fact, I think that the editor of that said something like, oh, we don't always know what Kaaron's doing, but we like it anyway, or something like that, which I've always taken to heart. I actually really like that. So, yeah, I love that story. That's quite a bizarre story, but I still remember your reaction to it and how it was one of those things that inspires you as you go along, as to have that sort of reader reaction. But, yeah, I remember that first meeting.
Well, I have been known to inspire fear, certainly. But, yes, and out of that oeuvre, there's an astonishing number of awards. Just to take a few highlights, The Grief Hole, your novel of 2016, that won the trifecta, Aurealis, Ditmar, and Australian Shadows Awards.
Yes, that was very exciting.
For Best Novel. Let's see, Sky, the title novella in your collection Through Splintered Walls. What was that? That was back in 2012. That one, Ditmar, the Australian Shadows, and what was it, the Shirley Jackson?
Shirley Jackson. I'm pretty sure it won the Aurealis too. I think it did get the, I think that one got the trifecta as well. But yeah, it did get the Shirley Jackson, which is very exciting. I was judged with Shirley Jackson for a couple of years, so I know how competitive it is. And I still remember thinking I'd go to sleep and wake up to the result, and then, of course, not being able to sleep and getting the result on my phone at about 3 o'clock in the morning and waking up the whole household with my squeals. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. More recently, you've had an entire primer to your works put out by Dark Moon Press, Exploring Dark Fiction #2, a primer to Kaaron Warren. Your most recent releases, I think you've got, they're reprinting your first novel this year.
Yes.
Slice.
Yes.
They're reprinting that. And you also have Tool Tales.
Yes.
I believe is the most recent thing to actually arrive.
Yes. That's a really fun one. And yeah.
Yes.
Collaboration with Ellen Datlow, which is, talk about career highlights, that has got to be up there.
Wonderful. Now, Kaaron, after all that build-up, do you have something you would like to read us?
I do. So I thought, like Ellen, I thought I'd read something that's not actually in print yet, which is hopefully coming out this year. It's a novella coming out from Cemetery Dance, which has been a couple of years. You know, of course, everything's been put back due to the madness of the last couple of years. So hopefully this year, this novella, which is called Bitters, will be coming out. So I'm just going to read the opening part of it, which will hopefully give you some indication as to what it's about. An hour it took McNubbin to drive to work, and the stink of the man with him all the way. What he did was listen to the audiobook of his wife reading History of the Man. She did it for him and no one else. Her love letter to him, her voice all soft and sexy. She made the recordings when they were early together, and still the words brought back to him those hot days when they were fit and young and carefree. He's got all his limbs, this huge metal man, and we know he's a man because he's got that too. Stiff and long, halfway down his thigh, semi-erect, and always that way. Her voice all breathy. 3 men, arms stretched, can only just touch fingers around one shin. You'd have to stand 60 men tall to reach his head if they weren't steps winding around. His arms are crossed over his chest as if he's hugging himself, and one finger pokes out, admonishing us all to behave. The metal is copper-coloured, but not copper, some substance long since exhausted, the last of it melted to forge this giant. He's been here well beyond living memory, more than 1,000 years. It took 100 years to build him, section by section, the workmanship so perfect that if you run your fingers over the joins, you can only feel a slight ridge. The first bodies went in while he was still being polished. The 11th broken girl was so fresh dead, McNubbin could feel the last of her pulse, he thought, could feel the blood flowing, although nothing else was there. He carried her up the 400 steps to the man's mouth, sad for her strength and future, love and all ahead of her, and later said to his workmates, "Where are they coming from, these broken girls?" They all had the required ID, the approvals, the medical proof of drug-free, yet none were local. Locals weren't flawed. These ones had skin blemishes, cloudy eyes. You could tell they hadn't taken the bitters all their lives. Who was breaking? Mostly McNubbin didn't question who he carried up to the man's mouth. The only rule was they had to carry the bodies to the man within 3 days. Sooner the better, freshest best. It was not their business who was who, not theirs to decide. Although carriers were trained to smell the wrong ones, those too long dead or preserved or filled with drugs. They didn't go into the man. People didn't realise how skilled the carriers were. Jarvis, a carrier long ago gone missing, had been a stickler for it. The bodies he rejected. Thing was, he was always right, and when he said no, all of them refused. It wasn't that they didn't sneak some in, but mostly the sneaky ones came from the professors. Tweaks to the bitters. The carriers would never put the bitters at risk. Jarvis thought he knew better than the professors, better than their supervisor, better than the other carriers. He knew how to say no, that's for sure. That was a man barely missed, a loner, no friends, no family. McNubbin did wonder sometimes why he ran off, considering his obsession for the job and nothing else in his life. But each to their own, and his not to judge. The 11th broken girl seemed to shift, and he imagined, as he sometimes did with the nice ones, that she was still alive. He imagined carrying her back down and keeping her safe in his small house, making her soup, and she would rub his feet for him with her thin, cold fingers. His wife wouldn't mind. Her fingers were old and tired and well past growth. McNubbin started carrying at 14, one of the youngest, and he was proud of that. He felt every step now, 32 years later, but still he climbed steadily. You had to take each step on its own merit. They were well maintained, serviced every single night, but even so, fluids dripped thick and slippery. You had to watch your footing. A fall could break all your limbs, and had. McNubbin's brother had tripped over and fallen head, toe, to the ground. They had to scoop him up in order to carry him back to the top, and that was McNubbin's job. Much as it still gave him nightmares, it was no one else's place but his to tip his own brother in. No one else's place to tell his widow too and whisper it over the head of his tiny baby girl and tell lies to his son, 4 years old and not so bright. The girl's breasts pressed into his back as he carried her slung that way, and her thighs under his fingers felt both soft and firm. Step by step, he reached the top. The smell was far worse up there, and you had to be careful because your eyes might tear up and your head spin no matter how used to it you were. It was a chemical thing, they'd been told in training. You did not want to be dizzy at the top. His head was the only open part of him, and that hole, right at the top and angled for access, was big enough to take the bodies. His head tilted back at an angle that would hurt a real man, his mouth wide open. No teeth. More than once, fat men had been sliced in two to fit. Children slipped in easy, as if on a fun ride. Women bent more going in, and no one had the answer as to why. Quickly now, no longer enjoying the feel of the woman's body, McNummon propped her against the metal head, reached over to the knife rack and selected his favourite, a medium-sized blade. He drew it quickly across her jugular, making sure she was dead before tipping her expertly into the mouth hole. It was a nightmare they all shared, the idea of ending up in the man still alive. So this final slash was another job the carriers had to do. Regardless of the cause of death, they slit the throats. He heard the broken girl fall, passing through the broad throat onto the breastbone and thud into the chest area. He waited for a moment, his head tilted sideways, listening for the faint gurgle, the sound of shifting as she sank. He liked to hear it. It meant the job was complete. That's the end of my excerpt.
They're very grim.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I am conflicted now.
Why is that?
On the one hand, I am now desperate to get hold of this novella you said.
A novella, yeah.
Yes. What month is it due?
Oh, I don't know. It's honestly, it's been about 3 years, and it's very. I haven't quite figured out if it's even going to come out this year, but we hope so. So hopefully the next couple of months. I will let you know. Don't worry.
Well, on one hand, yes, I'm desperate to read it. On the other, I'm really, really apprehensive.
Yes. Well, it doesn't get much nicer from there, so but you'll enjoy it, I'm sure.
Now, it does remind me, just that little snippet, in just that piece, you've conjured up this landscape, this incredibly vivid, bizarre territory. And that seems to me to be something that a lot of your work has in common. And I'd like to ask you, where do these things emerge from, these landscapes?
Some of it is, so I'm just going to see if I can, there we go. Yeah, sometimes it seems to be almost a dream-like, I suppose, like something like this giant metal man where you put the bodies, and the idea being that right down the bottom, there are people who are called toe tappers, and there's a little tap on the toe and out comes the bitters at the end. So whatever liquid is created in this man comes out the end, and that's the medicinal stuff that we've been talking about. So I guess in part that the idea for that came, that's how they make, what's it called, the old fish sauce that they used to make in Roman times. I can't remember the name of it.
Yes.
And just how revolting. They'll just leave fish in a barrel for months until it was so foul that it would all turn to liquid, and yet be quite tasty, apparently. But the man himself and the landscape that he sits in, I don't know, it was just kind of a subconscious vision, I guess, that came to me. Some of those sorts of things that are really very different and not based in our reality quite often do just come to some kind of a little subconscious collaboration, I suppose, of things that I've seen and things that I've heard, and somehow they form an image, and I try to get it onto the page. It is quite photographic in my head, though. Like, I can see these things really, really clearly in my head, and if I was an artist, I would actually be able to paint them very easily, I think. But I'm not. I'm a terrible, terrible artist. So I have to use words to try and paint the picture instead.
Is it, well, I'm quite sure we'd all prefer that there wasn't an actual real place called the grief hole.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it certainly does exist in various forms, doesn't it? In almost every place that you live, there is a place that could be the grief hole. It draws people to it, creates awful feelings, but then also the people deliberately choose to go to, maybe to even encourage those feelings. Yeah, I don't know. So that place itself, I don't think exists. But I think variations of it do exist in various different formats.
How different is the process from creating these landscapes to creating the people who exist in them.
Yes.
Sometimes I feel that we get so close to the characters in your books that their minds and personality is a landscape in and of itself.
That's so interesting. Oh, well, it's a very, very flattering thing for you to say, Kyla, so thank you. But they're probably similar in a way too, until I can actually hear, like I really do actually hear, I mean, I hear the voices in my head pretty much, like I think many writers do, and I can see them in my mind's eye. I can actually see these people. So they do feel very alive to me, and if they don't, I have to keep working on them until they do, and there often does come a certain moment where suddenly they're alive and real to me, and that's when I feel like they become real on the page. Sometimes it's a matter of layering, you know. I know who I want them to be, but I don't know how to get that across yet. So I'll just put little notes to myself about, like the story I'm working on another novella at the moment, and something happens to one of the characters, and I've got reminder notes throughout saying, make sure we give a shit by the time we get to this moment, because otherwise there's no point, right? There's no point killing people off and having terrible things happen if you don't care very much about that. So it is a really important thing to me that we have some level of care or connection to the characters, likeable or not, even the unlikable characters. We need to have an emotion for. So the process, yeah, that's a really interesting question, whether or not it's different creating a landscape as to, I suppose in landscape you really can be more directly descriptive, and so it makes it easier. Like with the man, I can just describe what he looks like without being as subtle about it. Whereas with my character McNubbin, like already I've had to sort of subtly give us an idea of what sort of person he is. We've already know what his lifestyle might be. But I've had to do that much more subtly, I suppose. Yeah, and I don't know why. Like, I'm just thinking about it. Like you kind of like to make your own impressions of a person. Like, I don't want someone saying to me, "Oh, Kyla always looks amazing," which you do. I want to meet you and say, "Oh my gosh, you look amazing." I want my own impression, and maybe that's how the reader becomes more connected to a story, if they're getting their own impression rather than being told something about a person. Whereas with landscape, we are vividly creating a picture, so I can tell you what it looks like. I don't know, that's just occurred to me. I don't know what you two think about that. Is that one of the reasons why we don't just have a whole paragraph describing a character's personality? We instead try to weave in things so the reader gets their own impression of that person. Like being told, when someone says to me, "Oh, I'm very funny," like, well, you're not actually, because you've just told me you're funny. Like, if you're funny and make me laugh, then you're funny.
Yeah, it's like the nice guys, if they have to tell you they're a nice guy, they're usually not.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's true. I talk about that a lot, about never underestimating the intelligence of your readers. Give them lots of room to fill in, because they want to be transported. They want to exercise their imagination. So I think that's important, to let people build their own version. 6 people can read the same book and have 6 entirely different experiences, and that's what we want, I think, really.
Yeah, well, it's with different characters, and we like them or dislike them, or find someone attractive or unattractive, depending on what our past experience is, and likes and dislikes, and even our circumstances of the moment too, perhaps. So yeah, it's a trickier thing to build that character, but yeah, so very important, and important to me until that little ping goes off in my head and I know who my person is. And quite often it's a little tiny detail about, I don't know, something that they're wearing, or a choice of, like, I just want this character in the novel I'm working on. I had the character liking, for some stupid reason, I decided she liked eating beans, and I don't know why it was stupid. And then I realised actually she liked sausages. And once I decided that she liked sausages, all of a sudden, she's come to life. And I may not even talk about what she's eating, but the fact that I now know that she hates beans and loves sausages in a tin, which is really gross, that becomes a whole nother thing.
That's
fun.
This is how the magic happens, folks.
Yes.
Now, I think we might just let that percolate for a while. I'm sure it's going to engender some fascinating questions.
Good.
And I might move on to Alan.
Good idea.
Alan Baxter. Alan Baxter. Now, you've been writing I am aware of certainly for the last 20 years.
Close to.
I know you first came across, we first encountered each other round about the time of the last Melbourne Worldcon.
Yeah, that was 2010. And before that, I think you and I might have first met at the New South Wales Writers Centre a few years before that for one of those speculative fiction festivals.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so it'll be a few years.
Highlights of the calendar.
A fair while.
Yes.
And in that time, you have produced 7 solo novels, plus another 7 that have been co-authored with David Wood.
Well, 8 actually, because we just dropped the latest Sam Aston. So yeah, that's up to 8.
Ah, everything changes so quickly.
I know, we can't keep up. Yeah.
Well, that's a quite incredible outfit. When you add to that, I've got 4 novellas, including last year's The Roo.
Yes.
Oh, yes. And a quite incredible brace of short stories, including the award-winning Shadows of the Lonely Dead.
Yes, that was in Crowshine, which was the first collection. That's the one that got me the trifecta of nominations but not wins. I got the Shadows for that. One of those Shadows up there
yes.
for Crowshine, and another one's for Surf Cold. And yeah, and the latest collection is the Gulp, which is the novella collection. So
yes,
yes, and same did.
Again, it's an incredibly impressive oeuvre.
Thank you.
I myself remember very fondly The Chant of the Vagrant Mariner.
Yes.
A novella in the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy, January 2015.
Yeah, that was a high point for me. That was always a holy grail to try and sell a story to FNSF, because it's just been gold standard for so long. And it was really interesting because it was Gordon Van Gelder was the editor there for a long time. And it got to the point where I would get quite friendly rejections from him. And because I, was working hard to try and get a story in there. And then one day I got this letter with the fantasy and science fiction logo stamp on the back, and it was a different shape to the usual little typed rejections you used to get in those days.
Oh, we know them well, don't we, Kaaron?
Yeah, exactly.
I've never actually subbed to them, to be honest. So.
Oh, wow. Well, I finally got this thing. It was different. I was like, oh, they finally decided to upgrade to typed or printed rejections. And I opened it up and it was a check. There was no letter. There was no acceptance. There was nothing else. It was just a check. Holy shit. I was walking down the road with my dog at the time, and my son was a tiny baby hanging on my chest, and I'm ringing up my friends going, does this mean I've sold to us? And they said, well, yeah, I mean, you've got to check. I think that's an acceptance.
Maybe they'll pay you to not send them any more stories, Alan.
Yeah, maybe. And well, to be fair, that was the last episode that Gordon Van Gelder, or last issue, I should say, that he edited. He handed over the reins to Charlie Finlay after that, and I never managed to sell him one. And now Charlie's also retired, and there's an editor, Cherie. I'm having a mental blank, can't remember her name now. There's a new editor there now. So I'll be bugging a new editor again now to see if I can sell there again.
Now you've your series, the Bound series. Well, I believe that's the Alex Kane books.
Yeah.
They came out in 2014 through Harper Voyager, and they're being re-released.
Well, they are also released in the US, so there's a different publisher in the US. So still with Harper Voyager here in Australia.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And as you said, the most recent thing is your new collection, The Gulp.
Yes.
The Gulp. Now, I have questions to ask you about that, but you said you were going to read something new, so I think I'd better let you do so. Okay,
yes. Well, I was thinking about reading something from The Gulp. But then I realized that Sadie Hartman, who's she's a great reviewer and sort of promoter in the horror community, she had a birthday recently, and she got lots of people to record readings that she put on her YouTube channel in celebration of her birthday. And I read from the first story of The Gulp for that. So that's on Sadie Hartman's channel. And then with StokerCon, they talked about readings, and so I read the start of the second story from The Gulp, and that's on my YouTube channel now after it was a StokerCon reading. So then I thought, well, if we're doing this, I'll read something new. And this is new, it's not out yet. It's from a short story called Nurturing His Nature. And it's coming out, there's an anthology called The Bad Book coming from Bleeding Edge Books. It's edited by John F.D. Taft. And the idea behind the anthology is the Bible is always referred to as the good book, and it's got the parables and the fables and whatever else. And so John Taft decided to put together the bad book, which is basically the antithesis, with the sort of fables and yes, the parables of not such good things. Yeah, and so this is a slightly abridged version of the opening to that story, so I'll read that. Darkness hides a multitude of sins. If Drew Hancock had a motto, that was probably it. He smiled as he sinned, his orthodontically straightened teeth, no doubt the only glimmer in the wan moonlight leaking through the trees. A weak mule from the cat as its life fled, and Drew sat back with a satisfied sigh. A sexual sigh, the thrill of his desecration pressing against the front of his jeans. After a few minutes basking in the glow of his ministrations, his exultant high slowly eased back as it always did. With an altogether less satisfied sigh, Drew dug into the soft, loamy ground and buried the mutilated remains. Cats went missing all the time, that's what made them so useful. The twin girls, 4 doors down from his house, would be distressed and grief-stricken for a while, but their parents would probably buy them a new kitten to console them. Drew smiled crookedly, wondering how long he'd be able to resist bringing that one into this dry bush behind his sprawl of track housing. It wasn't his fault. He was made this way. He stood and started picking his way back through the gum trees and low scrub towards the path that would eventually lead him to the closed end of the cul-de-sac where he lived. A piece of Oz all our own, his dad had proudly said once, which was ridiculous because some arbitrary patch of land was hardly a bit of land all their own. The council had rules about what they could do with it. There were neighbours either side and across the street, only too ready to twitch a curtain and report the slightest thing out of the ordinary. And ordinary was so hellishly boring. Drew hated how many rules and regulations existed to corral everyone into towing the line. He was stifled by everything around him, but he occasionally did find his outlets, his moments of joy. He'd recently turned 18 and there were only a few months left of high school, then he could tell everyone to go and get fucked. And he would get out, find a smaller town, somewhere more remote, an easy job. Something to make money enough to cover a cheap rent, a place with lots of space and few prying eyes, where he could indulge his proclivities. The further a person went from civilization, Drew had decided, the more they could live as their true self. A silhouette caught his eye and he gasped, stopped dead in his tracks. Drew was only 100 meters or so from the narrow path that ran along the back of his housing estate. He saw a glow from the street lights and even a few lit windows like bright square eyes in the dark. But the silhouette stood in deep shadow, just beyond the light leaping over the path. A man, a little overweight, probably a similar height to Drew himself, and absolutely motionless. Drew blinked. Must be a trick of the shadows. He moved slightly and lost sight of the man, the trunks of the blue gums becoming a dark mass again. A smile started to form, Drew chastising himself for paranoia, when movement made his heart thump an extra beat. The man had stepped to one side to put himself back in Drew's eyeline, then stopped still once more. He wanted to be seen. Drew felt as though he were on a knife edge of action. 2 futures lay ahead of him. In one, he approached the figure and took his chances with whatever ensued. But it could be a madman, he might have a knife, or worse. Drew looked down at his hand. He had a knife too, sticky with cat blood. It was razor sharp, but only small, 3-inch bladed folding penknife. It was for controlled actions, surgical almost, not fighting. In the other future, Drew ran the hell away and got indoors safe from this stranger. Drew wasn't really a fighter, though he was fit and worked on the heavy bag in the garage quite often, but he didn't like unpredictable violence. He ran. Bursting from the bush into the street was like stepping between worlds, the sudden asphalt and streetlight instantly surrounded by habitation instead of nature. Drew's trainers slapped the pavement as he ran about 100 meters up to his place. Another 100 meters led to a bigger road, and that snaked around to an even bigger road, and that led to the main road right into Moncton. So much better to be in the suburbs, his parents insisted, where people were still neighbourly. They were just like all the other busybodies, but right now Drew decided the close proximity of everyone was a blessing. He didn't dare look back to see if the stranger was following, but ran straight up the driveway, in the side gate, and then slowed and paced calmly around to the back door. Drew closed the door and took a breath to steady himself. He was gassed from the sudden sprint, sweat on his brow and trickling down his back. Only early spring, but the nights were warming up already, unseasonably so, in fact. Drew headed for his room. The curtains in Drew's room were open, and he saw the man standing in the pool of streetlight outside. Drew froze, staring. He would be framed in the light from the hallway behind him. The stranger must be able to see. What else had he seen? Had he watched what Drew did to the cat? Had he hidden there, observed all of it? If so, why hadn't he said anything, done anything? Shaking started in Drew's hands and knees. The stranger was motionless, staring for what seemed like minutes on end, but was probably less. Drew jumped as the stranger raised one hand in a slow wave, then turned and strolled away along the street. And things get more complicated for Drew after that. And there is a slight attachment to the Gulp there, because might have noticed a reference that Moncton wasn't far away. So it's not a Gulp story, but it's not far away.
I was wondering if we'd plumbed the depths just yet. I'm glad to see we haven't.
No, there's another collection coming, hopefully, before too long. A second set of tales from the Gulp is in planning, and I hope to write later this year. That's so with any luck, there'll be another volume, because it's been quite popular, which is fantastic. So that won't be in it. That will be in John's book, but yeah.
Well, that I found truly chilling.
It's a lot of my stuff is quite supernatural, and sometimes there's stuff that isn't. And that's one of the ones that isn't so much. So yeah.
All the same, I think it takes us. You literally took us, as the character was aware, out of the normal and back in, like it was a gate that could be opened and shut.
Yeah, or opened and never shut again.
Ah, that's good. Now, let me see. I was reading some of the reviews of your various works. And this little piece, this little snippet, it reminded me of some of the things people say. This is, of course, about not even the violence per se in your books, but the presence, the atmosphere that seems to pertain to them. Now, I'm not going to ask for spoilers, but you seem to create a lot of characters that exist, at least on the peripheries of violence, whether it be their own capacity or things that have been done to them. Can you add anything to this?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? And the more work you do, the more, in some ways, the more you become aware of where, where your sort of focus often lies. Interestingly enough, it first came about when I was working with Ticonderoga Publications, putting together Crow Shiners, the first collection of short stories, finding stuff that works together, and then working with Grey Matter Press to put together Serve Cold, which is the second collection of short stories. Because when you're sort of putting collections together, you're looking for, among the best of your work, obviously, because that's what you'd hope to see collected, but also stuff that has a certain cohesion in theme, or so it's not just kind of just random, here's 20 things I wrote, but an actual sort of cohesive vibe to a thing. And it seems that regardless of what I actually set out to write in terms of the story and in terms of character or whatever, I'm often really quite heavily focused on justice and injustice and the consequences of action and stuff like that. That really seems to be the sort of stuff I explore. And I've experienced a lot of death and violence in my life in different ways. Death through terminal illness as much as anything else. Like Devouring Dark was you mentioned before, Shadows of the Lonely Dead was a short story that drew up from my experience of terminal illness that I hadn't tapped nearly enough at the time, and then an entire novel came along that was basically a sequel to that story to explore that. And so I think with that sort of experience, that's what I find myself coming back to a lot of the time, the fact that there really are there really are people out there on the peripheries that get away with all sorts of shit. And if we lived in a just world, they wouldn't so much. So I think I tend to explore that a lot in the work that I do, whether supernaturally or just through people being bastards in one way or another. I don't know. But yeah, that's that sense of justice or lack of it, both in action and in just the greater nature of this sort of cold and uncaring universe that we live in, seems to be something I draw back to a lot.
And that novel would be The Devouring Dark, yes?
Yes, Devouring Dark, that's right. Yeah, it's basically a London crime sort of gangster novel, but it's also my great meditation on death and dying and the justice of it. Yeah.
Kaaron, do you mind if I step in, Kyla? I just want to ask a little bit about the nature of violence. And do you think you need to understand violence in order to write about it? And do you think with the martial arts that you do, I know there's not an inherent violence in it, but do you think there's the possibility of violence in it that maybe helps you understand it a bit?
Yeah, I think there is to some degree. I mean, I fought a lot, and so even under controlled conditions, like in combat sport, it is still the expression of violence. And without that focus, a lot of the time the expression of violence comes out in much less healthy ways in people, which is like one of the things I enjoy most about running a martial arts school, is being able to take people in, especially young men who have this sort of anger and this energy inside, and when you can find something to focus it into, that's incredibly healthy. And especially if you can focus that into something that actually feeds that desire for violence, because we are wonderful, clever and interesting, loving people, but we are animals too, you know, and there is that kind of natural animal instinct, and especially in young men where they're trying to find a place in the world. So a lot of the time, if you can give people a place to express anger and express violence, but in controlled and in a spirit of camaraderie as well, then it can be quite cathartic. And it applies very much to women too. A lot of the time, it can often take a lot longer to draw that out of women, because a lot of little girls are brought up to be nice and polite, and the boys rough and tumble and the girls don't, which is damaging in itself. But then once you do manage to draw that out of young women and they start finding that expression of anger and violence, it can be fantastic. You know, they can beat the crap out of things more than the boys ever do once they let it go. And so I think there's a certain sort of balance in that. And for most people, you don't need an expression of actual violence to come past it a lot of the time, you know. But for some people, then there is more of a need perhaps to actually, and a lot of the time, you know, you might physically exert that through various forms of exercise that are not as far as actual fighting, but just physical activity is usually enough for most people. But as far as I'm concerned, the best physical activity is martial arts. So, and it does give you a good idea of what it feels like to get hit and hit people and stuff. So that translates well when you come to write about it.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. That is very deep. No, I mean that.
Okay.
Okay, well, we've got a quarter of an hour left. And so I'd like to see if there are any questions coming from our audience. You can just put them into the chat. To get us started, we do have a question that a certain Lee Murray asked of us in advance.
Hi, Lee.
Yes, hi, Lee. She asked a number of questions, but the one I would very much like to hit both of you with is, what is your process for determining a standout title for a piece of work? Do you have something in mind and then write the story, or do you conjure the title once the work has been completed?
It's a mixture of both, totally and absolutely. Sometimes I start with a title, and then quite often I get to the end of the story and I've got to change it anyway. And that's often just a phrase that pops out into my head, or a little glimpse of something that I just like the sound of. And other times I write the whole story and then change the title 50 times until I get to the one that's the right one. Yeah, it's tricky. It's looking at quotes, and it's doing lots of reading and lots of research and waiting for the right little phrase to come through. And it's also, this is one thing I say, is that the title, the importance of the title is that when you find it, it has to speak to the heart of your story. And when you've got your title, that's when you know what the heart of the story is. So if it's not doing that, it's not the right title. Yeah, which is tricky. It's asking a lot of a title, but I think it's really important. The title needs to say this is what the story is about. It needs to be the final clue to the whole jigsaw puzzle or whatever, to a certain extent. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I hate titles, frankly. I mean, I love titles, but I hate coming up with them. Like all my novels are 1 or 2 word titles. Tends to be like Bound is very straight up, because the main character gets trapped in this situation, he gets entangled with it, and he has to try to break out. So those single word things can quite often come, but then a lot of the time with short fiction, I find with a novel you get a cover, you get a blurb, you get stuff that helps to develop what's going on, and the title is a part of it. A lot of the time with short stories, the title is all they get before the story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it kind of feels like the title of short fiction carries more weight. And I hate coming up with titles. I almost always start without one, and I almost always change it several times during the process of the thing, and then it's not unusual to then send it for publication and editor to say, love this story, but the title, can we talk about that? And it ends up getting changed again. In fact, the Gulp was probably one of the few that started with a title and carried on, because I wanted to write about this kind of fictional, weird Australian harbour town where all this mad stuff goes on. And I had that idea in mind for a long time. And when I first started thinking about it, I thought of, it's called, the town is called Culpeper, but everyone calls it the Gulp because the place has a habit of swallowing people. It just kind of came together like that as the name of this place. I think that's the only time I've ever started out with a title before I've actually started writing the work and kept it all the way through. So yeah, it's tricky, man. I hate coming up with titles most of the time. The Roo was quite an easy one to come up with.
I quite like it. I think I love it that it's part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I don't mind it, but I find
it
it frustrates me trying to get it right. I feel like there's a lot of pressure to it in some way.
They should be interesting though. Like I think you got to try and be interesting in them.
Yeah.
Now we've had a Gulp specific question.
Oh.
Yes. Here we are from Matthew. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Matt.
Yep. Gulp 2. Novellas or short stories, and will it be chronologically following on from the events in the Gulp?
Okay. Well, the Gulp, the first one is 5. The novellas really, the first 4 are around 20,000 words each, and the last one I think is about 12 or something. And each one is sort of its own thing, but then there's this arc that goes over it that sort of all pulls together at the end, but then it's also sort of a bit of a cliffhangery end as well. And so the next one, the planning at the moment, but the next one will be similar. It'll be a set of long stories, probably novella, probably 5 again, ideally novella length stories. And the plan is that the last one of the second set of 5 will kind of wrap up the whole 10, if that makes sense. And there will be lots of, I hope that I get to keep writing stories set in Culpeper for plenty of time to come. So what a reviewer once said, when the Gulp first came out, someone said Baxter's found his Castle Rock, which I thought was a great sort of review comment. And it's true really, because it is somewhere I would like to go back and visit. So yeah, but in particular Gulp 2, I think will be another set of 5, and it will kind of close off to some degree what was set up in those, with lots of opportunity then for future stories. But it's not written yet, so anything is subject to change. That's the plan though.
Okay, got another question from Aaron. Hello, Aaron. Yes, and I think this one might swallow up our remaining time.
Okay.
Because he has asked, he says he loves what you've all been saying about crafting real 3-dimensional characters to inhabit these fantastic landscapes that you both create. With this in mind, and avoiding spoilers, of course, do you both have a favourite villain you've created to inhabit your worlds? And what made that villain feel real to you?
Gosh, that's a tricky one, isn't it?
I
don't know. See, I don't write. My villains tend to be the heroes of the stories quite often, so I don't really think of them as villains necessarily. So, but certainly Stevie in Slights, I suppose, would be the obvious one for me, because she's with us for 100,000 words, and she's a serial killer, and that's probably not so much of a, the book's been out for 10 years now, so hopefully people know by now that that's what happens in that one. But I just had so much fun with her, because I think she's really funny, and I tried to understand her, not from a killing point of view, but from the sense of loneliness and isolation that she feels. And that's what I think. Actually, I think one of the other questions that Lee was going to ask on the Facebook list that she put in was about the difference between short stories and novels, and how do you know when a story is ready to be a novel and not a short story. And this was one of those, because I had so much that I needed to explain about her and understand about her that there's no way it could have fitted into a short story. So I tried to fit her into 3,000 words, and she just wasn't fitting. There was so much about her, so many amazing, interesting stories that needed to be told. So yes, I think she's probably, I do like them all. I certainly like Solovictus in The Grief Hole. I find him still very chilling, even to think about, and trying to make someone who is outwardly incredibly charming and charismatic, but we know really what he is on the inside. I enjoyed that challenge, and I've met people like him, and I know what they look like. And yeah, I was reading some old notes about the creation of that character, and I realised we had a neighbour who had a very outwardly kind and good nephew who was actually completely horrendous and horrible, and he had this shiny face and these bright eyes, and he looked like somebody you could trust very much, but he was a very, very horrible person. So Solovictus, in a way, that's the image I have in my mind of this apparent shiny nice man who is not so at all.
I think you make a good point there, Karen. I do have a lot of, because a lot of my stuff kind of crosses into crime quite heavily, as well as horror and like weird supernatural and whatever. So I do tend to have sort of straight up bad guys, like Vince Stratton in Devouring Dark is kind of very much a bad guy that I had a lot of fun writing, because he's just a gangster who refuses to be called a gangster. He thinks he's so much better than that, but he's not. He's just a gangster. But I think in some ways maybe one of my favourite, and again it's because of this, like you said with Stevie, Karen, you get to spend a lot of time with them. Mr. Hood in the Alex Kane series was a good kind of almost like a Bond villain bad guy sort of in the first one, with this big company and all this money, and he manipulated everything, and the only thing he cared about was riches. And then but the way that the stuff that just kept happening to him through the course of those 3 books, and the way he just kept going, and I had a lot of fun with him, and it was interesting. I think that he went from being entirely driven by power and money to being entirely driven by this need for revenge, which was kind of an interesting arc in its own way to write from, because you when you put yourself in characters and you try to write them, the sort of drive you try to find, so that what they do is sort of coherent to their character and stuff like that. It can be quite good fun, to develop those things. I don't know. I think Mr. Hood's probably one of my favourite villains. But I wrote, it's a trilogy, it's like 300,000 words across 3 books. He wasn't really in the middle one, but the character sort of existed through the whole trilogy arc. So probably a favourite.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, and I do have another favourite actually. Sorry, just to go randomly. But there's a story in Serve Cold. There's a story in that called Exquisite, which has just come out on Pseudopod actually. Dan Raybarth did a great reading of that. And I can't really say much about it if you haven't read the story, but that character, the bad guy in that, I creep myself out with that guy. So yeah, so I think he's a bit of a character, and he will appear again. So.
Just what we always wanted. All right. Now, just as we have to start winding up now, I'm sure we could keep discussing this for at least another hour. But I think it might interest our viewers if you would each say just a few words. You've each produced a non-fiction writer's guide, concentrating on different aspects of the craft. Could we perhaps get a few words from you, Alan, about that, and then Kaaron to follow?
Sure. Yeah, well, we talked about the fighting and stuff like that before. And I started quite often getting asked to run workshops on writing good fight scenes and action scenes. And out of that, I put together a short ebook called Write the Fight Right, which is basically all sorts of tips on writing good fight scenes. And that's been out for a long time. And then last year, Brainjar Press got in touch and asked could I collect some of my non-fiction and writing advice stuff for a chapbook series that they're doing on Writer's Guide. And with that sort of focus on the craft of writing horror, writing action and writing fights and stuff like that, we ended up putting together this chapbook called The Martial Art of Writing, which takes a variety of essays and guest posts and blog posts and all sorts of things from across probably 10 years or so of non-fiction writing for different things. You know, when a book comes out and you do a blog tour or stuff from my own blog or guest posts for Horror Writers Association and stuff like that. And they've all been sort of gathered together and collected. So it's a sort of what you'd expect from me, I suppose. It's a ranty, sweary kind of guide to writing and action and sucking it up and sitting your ass in the chair and doing the work. So it's kind of part writing guide, part motivational guide in my own special way, and part tips on other things.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, Kaaron, I believe Brainjar Press is releasing any day now, Capturing Ghosts on the Page.
Yes. Well, mine was a similar experience to Alan's. Peter Ball approached me sometime last year to say that he wanted me to be a part of the series, which I was absolutely thrilled by. And he had a few favourites of mine, even an old blog post actually from Live Journal. Even he'd remembered a Live Journal post that I had done quite a few years ago that he really loved. And had read a couple of essays and interviews and things with me. So I just wanted some of my insights into the writing process, and we ended up with a workshop, I do this dream workshop where I help people to turn their dreams into stories, to stop them telling me what their dreams were, because I hate people telling me what their dreams are. And various other things like that, including there's a little bit about how to deal with professional jealousy, which I think is important for all of us. And various things like that, tips on how to use your ideas, how to write for a themed anthology, there's a lot of themed anthologies around now. So some of my processes for the themed anthologies that I've written for, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's great. No sort of overarching theme, I suppose, with it, apart from how to turn your ideas into stories that people are going to want to read.
The overarching
how not to be a bastard.
The voice of Kaaron Warren.
Yeah, that's right.
Theme enough.
Yeah, so not very ranty, but quite kindly, I think. kind of Auntie Kaaron advice on how to write nasty horror stories.
I'm more like the commando from The Biggest Loser, and you're more like the nice friendly neighbour next door.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you get scones at my place, so.
All right. Well, I'm afraid that is our allotment of time in the Redback Room for this month. Kaaron, Alan, thank you once again so very much for joining us, for chatting with me and imparting your wisdom for posterity.
Thanks, Kyla. That was fun. Thanks, Al.
Thanks for having us.
If you have any links you would like to leave, we're going to keep the room running for just a little longer. You can put them in the chat, so they'll be available. But apart from that, yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. I am Kyla. I have been your host. Come back again in 2 months' time, and we'll have some more webbing for you.
Thank you, Kyla.
Thanks, Kyla.
Have a wonderful night, everybody.